So a warm welcome from my side. My name is Machtheld and I'll be moderating the NESTwebinar number 8 already. So we're very happy to have Leah Fünfschilling with us today. Before we come to Leah and her insights, first some words on the structure. So we'll start with an input from Leah, and then after that we'll have a short break, a few minutes for you to breathe, but also for you to think about questions you would like to ask. So then we will put a link in the chat to an online question tool. There you can put in your questions and also vote for other people's questions. So then when we start the discussion, we will then take the questions that have the most votes. So please don't put your questions in the chat, but of course you can use the chat for discussions among you, but the questions rather in the question tool. Yeah, I think that's it on organizational stuff. So some more words on our speaker of today. So Leah is an assistant professor at Circle at Lund University, and she holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Basel, where she looked into the interactions and co-evolutions of actors, technology, and institutions in social technical systems. And as Abe mentioned, she's an active board member of the STRN and is also the main organizer of the upcoming STRN methodology school. So we'll keep you posted on that as well over Nest. And yeah, for today, she will share her expertise on institutions and the role of institutions in sustainability transitions. And I think, yeah, that's all I have to say. Then I hand over to you, Leah.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Let me share the screen. All right. Can you see this?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation and also for organizing this series. I really think it's a great opportunity, not just for early career scholars, but I guess also for us more established scholars to learn kind of how other senior scholars see the field and what they consider important research questions and how they approach a certain lens that is currently developed in sustainability transitions. And so I want to thank all of you guys at NEST to do that also in the name of STRN. I really think it's a great resource that we're establishing here, and I'm happy to contribute with today some insights on I called the talk an institutional perspective on sustainability transitions. And I called it an institutional perspective because what I will do is rather give you a bit of inputs regarding how to use insights from institutional theory to understand and conceptualize sustainability transitions, rather than only talk about what are institutions and why are they important. It is, of course, just as a brief introductory claim, quite a broad overview. It's very hard to fit all the different aspects or important lines of reasoning into a 30-minute talk. So feel free to ask questions that you wonder about, things that I left out. I do assume that most of you are familiar with the basics of sustainability transitions. I'm not going into that. But rather build on that knowledge from an institutional perspective. So let's get started. A short overview over what I will talk about today. As said, I want to give you a little introduction on institutional theory and sustainability transitions. And I'm going to introduce some of the basics of institutional theory, namely types of institutions, institutional logics, process of de-institutionalization and institutionalization, as well as questions about institutional complexity and coherence, because these are all the aspects or insights from the institutional literature that I will use to then ask the question, why is that relevant for transition studies? And I will give the example of the socio-technical regime and offer my take on the institutional conceptualization of a regime. And by that, I also want to make the disclaimer that what you're going to hear is my interpretation of institutional theory, and also of how that can be made fruitful for transition research. So it is basically built on my research, and should therefore also be read as my input, and not kind of a general statement on this is how to work with institutions in transition studies. It's more an overview of how I work with institutions in this area. So as a first kind of main division or lines of thinking, I think that one can distinguish the role of institutional theory in two ways. On the one hand, you could always ask about the role of particular institutions for innovation or for processes of change. So you could ask about the role of very particular policies or very particular standards or laws or values, etc., onto issues of innovation, innovation processes, innovation diffusion, or transformation, sustainability transitions. So in that perspective, you would start asking questions such as, why is a certain standard particularly relevant to foster technological innovation or more sustainable technological innovation? Or in what kind of institutional environment do radical innovations thrive? These types of questions. And that's a very common way of looking at institutions in many types of innovation studies, I would say. And you will find it in innovation systems, in the MLP, you will find it in a lot of kind of adjacent political science, institutional sociology, other types of disciplines that look at innovation and change. I am not myself particularly working with these questions, so I will only briefly talk about like types of institutions and maybe make some comments about their relevance. But what I really want to talk about, and that's a completely different type of perspective, is number two, namely understanding transitions as processes of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization. And that's kind of important to understand the difference, because throughout my career, I've always been labeled a bit the person that does the institutional stuff, and a lot of people have assumed that means that I'm particularly interested in, let's say, the institutional elements in the socio-technical regime or in the niche. But that's actually not true. What my work is mainly about is trying to conceptualize the whole process of change as one of the institutionalization of a new socio-technical configuration, meaning niche dynamics, as well as looking at the dynamics on the regime level, meaning the dynamics that you get from a very highly institutionalized socio-technical regime. And in order to understand how to do these conceptualizations, or why I think it's very fruitful to think of transitions as processes of institutionalization, I need to introduce some of the main insights, I would call them, from institutional theory. And when I say institutional theory, I'm mainly referring to organizational institutionalism, also often called new institutionalism. That's mainly because that's my background. I have a master's in organizational knowledge in sociology, so I'm rooted in organizational studies, so that's where I got into contact with institutional theory. There are many more types of institutional theories out there in social science, and they might all be valuable, like giving valuable insight for transition dynamics. But that's the type of corpus of literature that I am going to be looking at today. And the Sotheby reference is a reference to the Oxford Handbook of organizational institutionalism. It's also often referred to as the Green Bible. It's a really thick book where a lot of established institutional scholars have written about their specific perspective. So if you're interested, that's a really good place to start. And maybe as a general introductory comment, I would say that institutional theory needs to be understood as a kind of a response to the dominance of rational actor models, especially after World War II, and especially then in the 70s, 80s, 90s, institutional theory has developed a lot of insights, and the main argument was that they wanted to put forward is often to say that it's actually legitimacy is the driving force for a lot of behavior and a lot of the reasons why organizations look the way they do, and not rational action or functionality, as so often was present back then in organizational studies. So that's a bit as a background of how this theory actually became today one of the most, I would say, prominent theories in organization and management research, and also sociology. So it really made, there's even an article about the institutionalization of institutional theory. There is quite an interesting line of thought over kind of struggles of paradigms in social science that have been reflected in all of the disciplines in social science, I would say. So if I'm asked what are institutions, I usually say they are highly institutionalized structures. And by structures, that's my personal interpretation. For me, structures is pretty much, could be anything that impacts an actor's behavior. So in most studies, institutions are kind of a proxy for some form of environment or context of actors or any form of action. And therefore, a lot of the literature has, of course, focused on trying to clarify what are institutions, so what is that context? And one of the main ways, or one of the most cited ways to look at institution comes from Richard Scott, who has done work on institutional pillars. He has, if I'm not mistaken, gone through a lot of research done. I think the first time he talked or he came out with this article was in the 90s, and he went through a lot of institutional theory published to that date to look at, can we see commonalities and differences between the different institutions that people are actually referring to and talking about and providing their case studies on. And he thought that a differentiation between regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive institutions is a good way to go. And although that might not be, the most, it doesn't always fit, but I do think it gives you a very nice overview over the different workings of institutions, not just what they might be, but actually how they function. And just to say that regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive institutions are often named in transition studies as one and the same thing when people talk about institutions. However, they are very different in nature. So a regulative institution is not a normative one, and it's not a cultural cognitive one. But what is it? So one could argue that regulative institutions are things like laws and regulations that come with a very specific type of legitimacy, namely legal, and the institutional pressure they put on actors. So the reason why we comply to the institution and why it makes us change our behavior is coercive, meaning we must comply. We do it because we want to avoid punishment, and emotional drivers are usually want to be innocent or guilty if we break with it. And if we break with the institutions, then the sanctions are usually jail or fines or really kind of hard type of sanctions. Compared to the normative pillar, where we have things that are in the area of social and professional standards and expectations, and also values. So the legitimacy is more of moral nature, and the pressure that these types of institutions make is normative in nature. So it's something along the lines of that we should comply with certain expectations or standards. And the motivation of compliance is therefore basically to meet societal and professional expectations and gain honor and not shame. And if we do not comply to it, the sanctions that are associated with it is usually social exclusion. So we're just not, we can't participate any longer. We can't be part of an organization, of a family, of a religious community, of a professional community, etc. And with the cultural cognitive pillar, we are talking about taken for granted beliefs and kind of behavioral scripts. And this is a type of legitimacy that is very cultural in nature. And the institutional pressure that comes from cultural or cultural cognitive institutions is mimetic, meaning that we copy others. That can be due to uncertainty, but mainly the motivation why we comply and reproduce those institutions is usually rather involuntary. It's quite simple because we don't know any alternatives. We cannot conceive of another way of behaving. So that's why we do it. Or we copy the ones that we think are particularly successful, often in times of uncertainty. The emotional drivers are certainty versus confusion, one could say. So if you comply with it, then it feels right. You feel secure in your way of doing things. And if you're off, then it's just a complete state of confusion. That's also what people refer to when they're experiencing cultural shocks or the like. And the sanctions are a bit more indirect. The sanctions, if you're cultural cognitively not compatible, is often that you just don't understand each other. You don't understand what's going on, and therefore there might be ignorance and, of course, by extension, social exclusion, but not because you think somebody does wrong, but just because there is no real understanding of what is going on. So that is one way of thinking about, okay, so what can institutions be? What are they and how do they work? That's one way of looking at that. And then people have developed other types of concepts in institutional theory. And one that I will mention because it has been used in transition studies quite often is institutional logics, which can kind of be viewed as a stream of literature that tries to figure out the content of institutions and thinks more about institutional configurations. So what are the institutions out there in our society that are most important and are most crucial in driving our behaviors? And so institutional logics, the idea is that there's different sources of rationality, different kind of master principles of society that stem from central institutions. And of course, because the literature is Western, it's also what's described are Western, like the pillars of Western institutions. And these can be summarized as markets, corporations, the professions, the state, the family, the religion, and the community. And these types of institutions can be seen as like ideal types. They all come with a very particular logic of a range of normative, regulative, cultural, cognitive ideas of what behavior under that particular institutional sphere might mean. And one of the references that I also like is an article by Lansbury from 2002. You see, these are all rather foundational things. He says that logics have been conceived of as organizing principles that govern the selection of technologies, define what kinds of actors are authorized to make claims, shape and constrain the behavioral possibilities of actors, and specify criteria of effectiveness and efficiency. And so these types of institutional logics are usually believed to be found in organizational fields, and fields are a similar meso-level concept as socio-technical systems. And within transition studies, systems and fields have been used kind of interchangeably. The MLP thinks that organizational fields or socio-technical systems are happening on the level of organizational fields, and therefore also institutional development will happen on that level. So that's another way of, another kind of central idea of institutional theory, that it's not just about what kinds, and not just about regulative, normative, cultural, cognitive, but also kind of figuring out, so which ones are, like, are there certain, you know, kind of master principles and really big institutions that dominate our behavior and our thinking in all states of life. And moving on to the idea of institutions and institutionalization. So an important insight for me was to understand that institutionalization is a variable. So structures are institutionalized to different degrees. And therefore the difference also between structure and institutions, you can have a lot of structural elements that might never reach the ultimate institutionalization, but still have some certain power over behavior, over an actor's thinking. So the degree institutional theory, and I listed some of the main references that I like to go back to understand that in the bottom. I think is that the degree of institutionalization alters the impact that a structure has on actors and practices. And the degree of institutionalization is kind of dependent on, among other things, scale and scope of diffusion of a certain structure. So whether or not that's across different sectors or industries or societal fields, the duration of its existence. So how long has a system been guided by the same rules? How long has a structure been in place? Kind of assuming that the longer it has been in place, the more it will be, has co-evolved with all the other structures and will therefore be more persistent. Then invulnerability to social intervention. So it's kind of the resistance to change matters. The more something is institutionalized, the less it will go away just because a few actors are against it, or just because a few players are not playing along those rules. So if social intervention is not enough to get it out and destabilize it, then it can be considered highly institutionalized. And then there's the aspect of materialization or translation into practice. So a lot of the institutions, may they be regulative, normative, cultural, cognitive, or whole institutional logics, they can be translated into more concrete practices, into more concrete technologies. And you probably all know from STS studies that technologies also embed all our institutional kind of the grid of society. We embed values, we embed certain regulations, we make things more durable by translating cultural cognitive things into normative standards, and normative standards into actual regulations, etc. And of course, there's a big debate in institutional theory, which type of kind of construct or type of institution is most stable. And that's also an interesting question for transitions, of course. Is it is something that is regulative more stable than something that is cognitive? I guess the answer is always that it really depends on the co-evolution of things and how these have how these four things that I list here have been in interplay with each other. But that's one of the things to keep in mind, that institutions are not just there. They need to be reproduced, and they can be institutionalized to different degrees, or structures can be institutionalized to different degrees. And that's crucial if we think about transitions as deep structural changes. Then if one looks at how does the process of institutionalization look like, this is kind of a representation of how I read, especially older work from Berger and Luckmann on questions of institutionalization, where the kind of idea is that three distinct stages of institutionalization can be described. going from habitualization, or let's say first you have some kind of novelty popping up in all types of, actually all the time we get some form of novelty. MLP would say some form of niche development, something pops up. And then in the habitualization phase, the point is that you have very few actors, quite uncoordinated activity, almost no consensus on theory, knowledge base, the values, the users, and it's therefore very unstable and impermanent, and it could pop up and go away all the time, and it also does. With a lot of institutional work, or meaning actors putting in work to institutionalize, to come up with this new configuration, then there's a stage called objectification, where we see a consensus developing, we see some values in theory develop. The discourse is usually relatively high at this point because a lot of actors are involved, but the variance generally decreases. So there's going to be a little bit more agreement on what the new thing is and what it's for, and therefore the users become more heterogeneous. It's not just the first niche actors that did something, but you can start applying it in different contexts. And again, with a lot of work by actors, you can reach some form of sedimentation stage, kind of a complete type of institutionalization, if such a thing then exists, where one could think about some form of complete diffusion, some normativeness starts to come up, taken for grantedness, even as a kind of the last step. Usually you see less discourse because things are just taken for granted, and vested interests develop around the specific configuration. And you see also usually a low resistance, so a more kind of acceptance throughout the system. So that's one way of thinking about the process of institutionalization. And then deinstitutionalization could, of course, be seen as the reversal of that process. So from things that were very sedimented once upon a time might, due to all types of things that we discussed in transition study, be actually deinstitutionalized, or that's exactly what we're striving for in many sectors these days, to say we need a more sustainable configurations. So the regime has to go, it needs to look different. So we need to move from these sedimented structures that we work with today, they need to be replaced, and new ones need to be institutionalized. So that's part of the reason that type of process is what I see as a transition that goes from very niche to very regime, and from current regimes to new regimes. And in these processes, I see a lot of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization happening of the socio-technical configuration. And as a last input, like basic input of what does institutional theory offer us when thinking about transitions, is institutional complexity and coherence. So institutional complexity is quite central in organizational studies to explain organizational behavior, and especially field level institutional change. Meaning, if I would translate that to transition lingo, I would say it's about regime change and incumbent change. So a lot of, or it is important to analyze organizational behavior when confronted with a lot of heterogeneous institutional demands. So an actor is usually not just subjected to one institution or one institutional logic or one particular field, but we are all part of various different aspects, areas of society, and have very different types of institutional demands. And so a lot of literature in this regard looks at how do actors deal with that. And since it's organizational studies, they usually study organizations, often firms, how they deal with that, but the general idea can be put to any actor. The assumption is usually that being exposed to more than one institutional logic, or being exposed to institutional complexity, might open up windows of opportunities for agency and for innovation and for change, because actors can draw from and refer to different institutional environments. So you have legitimacy not only from one type of logic or one type of institutional field, but you can actually start playing around with different areas of legitimacy. And the sources of this institutional complexity are usually brought back to questions of institutions and institutional logics that form in various fields and geographical scales. There's a really good article by Charlene Sietsma on these different types of fields and different types of institutional complexities. So what do we know? Where does the big question being, where do institutional environments form? And that's also a question, by the way, that is very central in innovation studies from the innovation systems perspective. This is why we have so many different innovation system approaches. Some are sectoral, some are technological, some are national. And the main difference is that the authors believe that the relevant institutions form at a different level. So they can be forming around industries that we know. Industries and generally professions seem to be really big areas of societies where we develop a lot of institutional structures, but also certain issues such as climate change or other types of racism, general issues, dialogues that we have in society also develop their own kind of institutional fields. And then there are different geographies, as you all know that have followed the webinars on the geography of transition. So things can develop regionally, nationally, internationally, global. And so the point is to say that actors are always subjected to very different institutional contexts, and that we need to keep this in mind as maybe a driver for action, a driver for change. It explains why certain things happen in a certain way. And so how is this all relevant for the study of sustainability transitions, you might ask? And I try to exemplify that by looking at one of the transition concepts that at least my research has focused on trying to get a better grip on conceptually, trying to figure out more how it actually works. And that is the socio-technical regime. My general complaint about transition studies is that we all agree that the transition is a change in regimes, but almost nobody is studying regimes. And most people are studying niches and innovation. They're studying how niches upscale and how new things develop and institutionalize. But there is not so much research on what do actually regimes do, or how do they get reproduced? How is it that we even have to talk about transitions? Why can we not just, move to the next type of system that we want? So in general, regimes have been conceptualized as dominant rules of the games of a system. And I would say the evolution of the regime concept has gone from the early writings in transition studies that were mainly focused on evolutionary economics towards maybe a more an institutional turn that turned to institutional theory later on. So arguing from an evolutionary economics perspective, and that was Dozy and Nelson and Winter in the 80s, and then later on a lot of work by Ari Ripp and René Kemp. They used concepts such as technological paradigms and trajectories, or organizational routines and path dependency to show, to talk about the persistence of socio-technical systems. And there, the persistence is usually attributed to cognitive models and routinized practices, mainly in the engineering community. So the assumption was that technological innovation moves along the same path because engineers especially think along the same lines, and because they have certain cognitive ways of making sense of the world, and they have routinized practices, a lot of routines in place that at the end of the day, you always end up along the same line, and innovation is incremental instead of radical. And then as opposed to a more institutional conceptualization of the regime, which I don't think they're incompatible. They're just looking a bit at different aspects. So it was a kind of a shift more towards seeing that there are regulative, normative, and cognitive institutions in place, and also institutional logics, and that there's something like organizational fields that develop. And so the argument was made that the persistence actually stems from the institutional structures within a system, rather than only from cognitive models and routinized practices. Although, as you see, cultural cognitive institutions as well as routines are of course also considered institutional in nature. But it was a bit trying to figure out a bit more how the mechanisms of regimes go. And I think Geels in his 2004 article was one of the first ones that I think even cited Scott, introduced the 3 pillars kind of as a way to start thinking about institutions as one mechanism on persistence, on stability, on reproduction of the current status quo in a system. And then later on, I, in my dissertation, developed more the thought about institutional logics and general institutional rationalities, and tried to work with these things. So that's a first introduction into how the regime has been conceptualized, but still my kind of criticism that there's not much literature that really looks at regime dynamics and tries to understand, are there different types of regimes, and how does the specific nature of the regime affect transitions? And so that's what I wanted to do in some of my research. It's far from being finished, this journey. So I welcome you all into this line of thinking, and hopefully some of you will start gathering maybe some empirical material on this. But so in my thesis, what I wanted to do is to show that regimes can be considered institutional logics. And there has been a lot of discussion on this, and I have so far, I don't think, ever really convinced anyone that this is a good way to go. But I'm still kind of sticking with it, and I'm trying to make a case here again why I think regimes should be considered as institutional rationalities rather than just kind of highly institutionalized core of the system. So the assumption is that a socio-technical system, has a range of elements. And if I want to be very ideal typical, I would probably say I see 3 types of elements: actors, meaning organizations, states, individuals, and their type of networks that they engage in. There's institutional elements, regulative, normative, cognitive, such as policies, standards, values, all the things that I mentioned before. And there's material elements, usually technologies, but also all types of knowledge and all types of infrastructures, material in nature that is out there. And these types of, which are usually described in various papers as just certain, like nitpicking in regimes and what is part of the regimes and whatnot, as regime elements or just socio-technical system elements. And then the regime is said to be the dominant alignment of these elements. So which ones are kind of the socio-technical configuration that is highly institutionalized. However, I think it should not just be the configuration. I think it should actually be the institutional rationality that results out of this specific socio-technical configuration. Because if you describe regimes as rules of the game, rules are, to me, by definition, institutional in nature, and the rules are not the same as their actual, if you will, game pieces. So if you take chess, you have a certain rule set of how to play it. And then you have a board and you have the pieces, and you might have paper and you might have other things there to make this whole thing work. But the rules are, in my book, quite institutional in nature. And we have made some cases of why it makes sense to see regimes as rules or as institutional logics, partly because we saw effects of regime rationalities of dominant regimes globally. So you have the issue that maybe a system that has developed quite regionally suddenly becomes a best practice everywhere. And even though a specific place might not have any of the actual preconditions that is similar to the original development of the regime, they still abide by the regime logic, by the regime rules. So therefore, by definition, if it's possible that a regime has influence in a place where it doesn't actually have any materiality, it means that it needs to be in some form cultural, cognitive in nature, or normative, and it has that pressures action in a very similar direction all over the world. So that was one of the statements that we made in one of the papers, especially in the paper that I wrote with Christian Bindt on global regimes. And we think quite hard about on what level and what geographical level regimes develop. But you also find a general introduction in this idea of regimes as institutional rationalities. All right, and then if you have the idea that regimes are some form of institutional logics, then I think the quite cool thing is that you can start talking about specific characteristics of socio-technical regimes. And especially looking back to what I have introduced in the beginning from institutional theory, there are two things that I think are quite promising to integrate in transition studies. So one is the degree of coherence. One can quite safely assume that the existence, that in every socio-technical system you have an existence of multiple institutional logics. And the regime is therefore often characterized by an overlap of maybe professional, but also issue related and very geographical institutions. And as we know from the kind of multi-scalar dynamics or the geographies of transitions, it's always a discussion on what is the analytical boundary? Is it national systems of innovation? Is it national MOP studies? Is it national regimes? Or is it local or is it global? Like all of these always kind of make clear that we have an overlap over different types of institutional logics if we look at a specific socio-technical system. And then we can also safely assume that the logics are not all institutionalized to the same degree. So the strength of a certain regime might vary. And that both of these assumptions have, of course, implications for the conceptualization of transition dynamics. And in particular, this is a very preliminary way of looking at this. It's not something that has yet been studied or published, but it's a bit how I think of that it would be nice. We are actually currently working on that together with Christian Bindt and Johan Mjörner to talk a little bit about different types of socio-technical regimes. And if we take these two things that I mentioned, the coherency on the one hand and the degree of institutionalization on the other, and make a very basic rudimentary matrix, one could come up with a classification like this. So that on the one axis you have the coherency, meaning they can be unitary, very highly coherent, maybe only one very consistent logic has been in place over the past 100 years, not much of niche activity, nothing that threatens it, so very unitary. It can be competing, so you have different types of institutional logics that are dominating the regimes. They compete with each other for legitimacy and authority. And then you can think of it also as compartmentalized or prioritized. So there are certain socio-technical systems which show that quite a few kind of splintered regimes, have they also been called in the literature, have developed. So you could think of it more as subsystems that they exist next to each other, such as maybe in transport you have, you could talk about subsystems of car and public transport and the bike and things like that. And then on the other axis, you have the institutionalization, meaning could be high or low. And that leads to a characterization of, for instance, maybe we would find regimes out there in socio-technical systems that are very established, some that are very like emerging only, maybe more a type of niche starting to develop. We can maybe identify regimes that are very contested, systems that come with a very contested nature of the regime, or very fragmented if it's not really institutionalized yet, or you have the subsystem scenario also together with more the fragmented subsystems or emerging subsystems. So that kind of as an idea to start thinking about what would that mean for transition dynamics. How would innovation and change happen in established systems or established regimes versus systems that have a very contested regime landscape? So the degree and type of semi-coherence that you find in the socio-technical regimes might actually be one explanatory factor of transition dynamics. And this is my kind of concluding slide, where I want to talk a little bit about general implications for transition studies of these types of thinking, of thoughts. So I think one of the contributions could be to have to assess transformative capacity of different systems, meaning a more endogenous conceptualization of change, since with the MLP and also with a lot of the innovation systems, it's sometimes it's very much change is very much coming from the outside. So it's this landscape pressure, it's innovation, it's the niche, but it's very rarely really written about what does the regime structure itself do for change. And so when I say transformative capacity, I mean that the stability or the path dependency that is usually assumed or associated with the regime can also be seen as a source of change. So we could theorize kind of structural preconditions for transformative innovation and change. And especially this goes also into the, I would say, kind of a policy dialogue, maybe policy discourse, where the question is not just understanding transition, but how to intervene and govern them. And there the question, of course, is, does it matter what kind of regime you're dealing with? Does it matter how the regime looks like and how institutionalized it is and how coherent it is for the type of intervention measurements that you are suggesting? And can we think of, is there something like almost, I want to say, positive about stability? Can we see some features of regimes that are particularly prone to accelerate transitions to help us achieve deep structural change? And another avenue that line of thinking enables us is, of course, a different conceptualization of embedded agency. So all of institutional literature comes with the paradox of embedded agency. So the big question of how do actors shape the very environment that shapes their own actions, even though institutional theorists usually believe that these structures are socially constructed. There is, of course, a time lag between their construction and how fast you can change them and who can change them. But also their institutional theory has a lot to offer to conceptualize actors' behavior and especially their agency in regard to a structural context. But that's a lecture for in and of itself for another time. Another avenue is that the impact of landscape pressures are very different in the different socio-technical systems. So how do we understand why do certain landscape pressures have more effect in certain regimes or in certain systems than in others? And I think the nature of the regime plays a role there as well. So it might help to explain that. And then, of course, the same exercise we did with the regimes can be made with the niches. So also there, the process of institutionalization is important to understand how does a new socio-technical configuration come about, and niche regime dynamics especially. So how does the development of niches contribute to a destabilization of the regime, deinstitutionalization of the regime, and maybe a broader incoherence that then allows for some opportunities for change. All right, I will stop here. I hope I have given you some food for thought in that area, and I'm very happy to discuss further.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Leah, for your insights. And I think we got a good injection of institutional perspective now. So thank you for that. Shall we stop the recording, Leo?